There's a lot of different things with my garden that I change every single year, whether it be my garden layout or what I'm growing, the different varieties that I'm growing, or maybe if I'm growing in containers or if I'm not growing in containers. So many different things are variable with my garden, but there's one thing that stays the same every single year. And that is every single year, I start my garden off with a few inches of fresh compost. And I've heard a quote before. I have no idea who said this quote. So if you know, please let me know down in the comments. And whoever it was that said it said something along the lines of feed your soil, not your plants. And I really took this to heart because at the time I was just pumping my garden full of fertilizer, and that was just how I grew every year. And it worked really well for me. I'm not bashing on anybody that uses a lot of fertilizer, but when I really sat down and thought about this, feeding your soil, not your plants, I realized that I wasn't doing that. I was feeding my plants specifically. I was putting fertilizer straight to the roots of all my plants, and that's the only way I was really giving them nutrition. And about the time I heard this is when I moved here. I met the people that used to own this house. I was helping my best friend move in across the street, and we met the people that lived here, and they were getting ready to sell this house, and that's kind of how we stumbled into it. Well, the man that used to own this house, he used to garden this whole area. This was his garden first. And I looked at him and I was like, hey man, how is your garden so green? How do you keep it so healthy? You know, what kind of fertilizer are you using? And he just kind of laughed at me. He's like, I don't use fertilizer. I just keep my soil healthy. And so what I started doing before I started gardening every year, before the plants went in the ground, is I would order compost. I've got a compost guy, and he just comes with a dump truck and dumps it in my yard for me. I just text him once a year like, hey man, can I get like 6 yards of compost? And he just dumps it right next to my garden. It's nice. And every year I get this compost, and I put 2 to 3 inches on top of my beds. Before I had no raised beds, I had an in-ground garden, and I would do the same thing. I would just spread compost out around the whole thing. And when I first started doing this, I would till it into the ground. Shortly after that, I realized that's probably not the best way to do it, because what happens is you're disturbing all those little microorganisms and micronutrients and all these different things that are living at the top part of the soil. If you go to till it and you disturb that surface of the soil, it really kind of disrupts all those things. And like the weed seeds that have kind of worked their way down, you start bringing those up. And I learned after the first season that that's probably not the smartest thing to do. Since then, I put my compost on the top of my garden, and it has been a game changer for me when it comes to gardening and when it comes to my soil health. And it's something that I can never go back from. Now, there's a couple different ways you can go about this depending on what your situation is. If your situation is like mine, and you can do this before the beginning of your season, before you put any plants in the ground, that's the best way to go, because you have a clean slate. You can put the soil on top of your beds or on top of your ground, wherever you're growing at, and you're not disturbing anything. You can just lay that compost out, and it's going to be great. It's super easy. Put about 2 to 3 inches down and just let it sit. Especially if you have established beds or an established garden, this isn't something that you need to work into the soil whatsoever. Put it on the top, and those nutrients are going to work themselves down. After a few years of doing this, you're going to be building that soil, and pretty soon you're going to have a very healthy soil if you didn't already. But then if you're in a situation like I was last year, where you have a brand new garden or brand new raised beds like I did last year, I put all 16 of these beds in last year. 1 out of 10 don't recommend doing that much work in one season. It was so much work. What you want to do is in your new garden, in your new raised bed, or in your new bed, wherever you're going to be growing, take about the top 12 inches of soil and work in about 30% compost. That's what we did. We might have gone a little bit higher than that, but then after that, what we did is we took about 2 inches of compost and we put it on the very top layer of that soil. And then throughout the season, that compost and all that nutrition up there worked its way down into the soil. And honestly, I have never had a garden as healthy as I did last year. Last year, I don't know if you saw any of the videos I posted, but this was just overgrown with food, and it was amazing. And I 100% credit it to the work I put into the soil in my new beds and the compost that went into that soil. Compost is key. I didn't add any additional fertilizer last year. I just had compost that was really feeding my plants all season long. And honestly, this might take you a couple seasons to figure out how much compost your garden needs or how many times throughout the year. I know a lot of people, they kind of have split gardening seasons, so they will do compost twice a year. So once before each season. For me, I just have one big gardening season, so I just do it right smack dab at the beginning of that gardening season, and then let that compost kind of work its way down throughout the rest of the growing season. Experiment with it a little bit. Maybe instead of doing 2 or 3 inches at the very beginning of the season, maybe put down an inch to an inch and a half at one part of the season, and then another inch to inch and a half at the other part of the season. And I know that compost can be expensive, and I also know that it's hard to produce all of your own compost, especially when you're doing what I do. There is no way that I could produce enough compost to put into all my beds. This year I ordered 6 yards of compost, and I will admit that was a little much. Last year, to fill all my beds, I think I did something like 26 yards between the soil and the compost. So it was, when I ordered 6 yards of compost, it seemed like just a little bit, but it ended up being a little bit much. But I was able to fill some Vego garden beds that we put in the front of the house. We're growing with Vego garden a lot this year. We did last year. We started with them last year with all of these 16 beds back here, but we're starting a front garden and we just almost have it built. There's gonna be a video coming out soon. But if you're interested in Vego gardens at all and wanna see their raised beds, go down to the link I have down in the description, and you can go look at them there. If you're interested in the exact beds that I have the 17-inch tall 10-in-1 raised bed, and that one pretty much it just configures into different shapes and sizes. I have them in the 4 foot by 8 foot configuration in the 17-inch tall. That's what I'm sitting on right now. So luckily I ordered too much compost and I was able to fill some beds that I have in the front there. But I fully understand that getting a hold of compost is not something that everybody can just do like I did. So what you can also do is, instead of just putting it down across the entire bed or the entire grow area that you have, you can also just top feed the specific plants that you have. So forget about putting it down before the plants go in. But once you're putting the plants in, there's a couple things you can do. You can dig the hole for the plant, and then you can put some compost in around that hole, and then put the plant in and put the soil back around it. So that way you have some compost right there at the roots of that plant. And then what you can also do is, after that's in the ground, you can top dress just around the base of that plant, right where the roots are going to be sitting at. You can put compost around the top of that. So instead of putting compost around the entire raised bed or the entire garden, you can just put it on top of the plants, and that's going to go a really long way in giving your plants nutrition for the entire season. Now, you might notice that halfway through the season, your plants are looking a little dull and looking like they need a little pick-me-up, and that's where I would give it a shot of fertilizer or give it some more compost. This takes a minute to kind of figure out. Last year is really the first year that I dialed it in and got it figured out, and honestly, this year it might not work for me again. We'll have to see. I'm doing what I did last year. We're going to see how it goes, and I'll make sure that I let you know how it goes. But definitely don't just put the compost in like I'm telling you to do and assume that you're going to be great for the whole season, because everyone's garden, everyone's growing season, everyone's type of compost, type of soil is going to be different, and that could very well mean that your results are going to be different than mine. But generally speaking, no matter what, compost is a good thing for the soil, and it is a very good thing to focus on building your soil and feeding your soil rather than feeding your plants specifically. If you give your plants an environment and a soil that is healthy from the get-go, you don't need to be feeding them with all this extra fertilizer when they can just get that nutrition from the soil itself. So this year is going to be kind of an interesting year, because last year I felt like I planted relatively densely, but this year I'm really going to push it. I'm going to push the boundaries of what I can grow in here. I'm going to be growing things in my walkway over behind me here up against my fence. I'll be growing in that walkway. I'm really going to pack things into my bed. So this whole compost plan that I have might just fail this season. We're going to find out, but that's kind of the fun that I have with gardening, is experimenting, pushing the limits on what you can grow, and having fun while you're doing it.